The fire crackled in the center of the clearing, casting long shadows across faces Alara had known all her life. She stood at the edge of the gathering, just beyond the circle of warmth. Her hands were steady at her sides, but her heart beat against her ribs like something caged. The moon gathering had always felt like home before tonight. Now it felt like a place where choices were made that could never be unmade. Kalen stood across from her, on the other side of the flames. He had not moved since the elder spoke his name and hers together, since the words hung in the air like smoke, drifting between them with a weight she could barely hold. The bond claim, the ancient tradition, the Alpha King, calling her forward as his chosen. She had heard the murmurs ripple through the crowd. Surprise, curiosity, envy perhaps, from a few. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the way her chest tightened when she looked at him, and the way that tightness felt less like longing and more like losing herself. Kalen's gaze had not left her. It was steady, patient, impossibly calm. There was no command in it, no demand, just waiting, as though he believed she would come to him simply because the bond said she should. Alara drew a slow breath and stepped forward. The crowd quieted. She felt their eyes on her, felt the pressure of expectation like hands at her back, urging her toward the fire, toward him. But she stopped halfway, just close enough that the heat touched her skin, and she met his eyes across the flames. "I can't," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried. She saw the way his expression shifted, just barely, a flicker of something she couldn't name. Surprise, maybe, or hurt. But he did not speak, and she forced herself to continue. "I don't know you," she said, "and I don't know who I would become if I said yes." The elder beside the fire shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the crowd whispered, low and urgent. But Kalen only watched her, his jaw tight, his hands loose at his sides. "You're free to choose," he said finally. His voice was deep, steady, without anger. "I would never force your hand." She believed him. That was the worst part. She believed he meant it, and still she couldn't move forward, because the bond wasn't something she could control. It wasn't a choice. It was a pull, a certainty that felt too much like fate, and she had spent her whole life building a life that belonged to her alone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She turned before she could see his reaction, before the ache in her chest could grow too heavy to carry. She walked past the gathered wolves, past the elders who stared in stunned silence, past the fire that had once felt like warmth and now felt like accusation. No one stopped her. She didn't let herself look back until she reached the tree line. And when she did, just for a moment, she saw him still standing there, unmoving, watching her go. The firelight painted him in golden shadow, and for a heartbeat, she almost turned around, almost let herself imagine what it would feel like to walk back, to let him take her hand, to stop fighting the pull that whispered through her bones even now. But she didn't. She stepped into the forest and let the darkness swallow her whole. The walk home was longer than she remembered. Her village sat near the border, far enough from the capital that most wolves there lived quiet lives, untroubled by politics or power. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where you could wake to birdsong and fall asleep to the rustle of wind through pine. She had always loved it. Tonight, it felt too small to hold everything she was carrying. Her cottage stood at the edge of the village, tucked between two old oaks. The door creaked when she pushed it open, and the familiar scent of dried herbs and wood smoke greeted her. She set her cloak on the hook by the door and stood in the stillness, waiting for relief to come. It didn't. She moved to the window and looked out at the forest beyond. Somewhere out there, the gathering was still happening. Kalen was still standing by that fire, maybe. Or maybe he had already left. Maybe he had walked away just as easily as she had. The thought should have comforted her. Instead, it made her chest ache all over again. She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass and closed her eyes. She had done the right thing. She had chosen herself, her freedom, the life she had worked so hard to build. She was a healer. She had her work, her home, her independence. She didn't need a bond or a king or a destiny written in moonlight. She didn't. But the ache didn't fade. And when she finally climbed into bed, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering why doing the right thing felt so much like tearing herself in two. The days that followed were quiet. She returned to her work, tending to the villagers who needed her. A child with fever, an elder with aching joints, a young wolf who had twisted his ankle during a hunt. She moved through her routines with steady hands and a calm voice, and no one asked her about the gathering. But they knew. She could see it in the careful way they looked at her, the hesitation before they spoke. Word had spread. Of course it had. The Alpha King had claimed his mate, and she had refused him in front of everyone. She told herself it didn't matter, that their opinions couldn't touch her. But at night, when the village slept and the forest grew still, she lay awake and felt the weight of her choice pressing down on her chest like stone. She had been so certain. She had looked at him across that fire and known, with every part of herself, that she couldn't walk into his world and remain whole. So why did it feel like she had left part of herself behind anyway? She rose before dawn most mornings now, unable to sleep. She would stand by the window and watch the sky lighten, the stars fading one by one, and wonder if he thought of her at all, if he regretted the claim, if he had already moved on, chosen another, forgotten the girl who had said no. The thought should have brought relief. It didn't. One morning, she walked to the edge of the forest and stood beneath the trees where she had disappeared that night. The air was cool, the ground soft with moss. She closed her eyes and let herself remember the way he had looked at her, the steadiness in his gaze, the patience, the way he had let her go. She pressed her hand to her chest, over the place where the ache lived now, constant and quiet. She had chosen freedom. She had chosen herself. So why did it feel like she had lost something she couldn't name? She opened her eyes and turned back toward the village, toward her cottage, her work, the life she had fought to keep. And she told herself, again, that she had made the right choice, even if the sleepless nights and the weight in her chest whispered otherwise. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Almost. Aria woke before dawn, prepared her remedies, and opened her door to whoever needed her. She set bones and stitched wounds and brewed teas for sleepless mothers and restless children. She smiled when it was expected and spoke gently to those who came seeking comfort as much as cure. But the weight in her chest never lifted. It settled there like a stone she had swallowed, heavy and unmovable, pressing against her ribs with every breath. She told herself it would fade with time. That distance and routine would soften the edges of what she had done. That eventually she would wake up and feel whole again. She didn't. The villagers were kind. They didn't ask questions. They didn't press her for details or whisper in her presence. But she saw the way they watched her sometimes, their eyes careful and uncertain, as though they weren't sure what to say, as though they knew she had done something they couldn't quite understand. She couldn't blame them. She didn't understand it herself. One afternoon, old Marin came to her cottage with a basket of herbs and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. She set them on the table without a word and looked at Aria with the same quiet knowing she had always carried. "You're not sleeping," Marin said simply. Aria shook her head. "I'm fine. You're not. Marin's voice was soft but firm. You haven't been fine since you came back. Alara looked down at her hands. They were steady. They always were when she worked. But when she was alone, when the cottage grew quiet and the fire burned low, they trembled. I made a choice, Alara said quietly. I have to live with it. Marin studied her for a long moment. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we make for ourselves, she said. That doesn't mean they don't hurt. Alara nodded, but she didn't speak. She didn't trust her voice. Marin reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over Alara's. You don't have to carry it alone, child. Alara blinked hard, fighting the sting behind her eyes. I'm not carrying anything. Marin gave her a sad smile. Yes, you are. After Marin left, Alara stood at the window and watched the village settle into evening. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children ran home through the fading light. Somewhere, a wolf howled, and the sound echoed through the trees. She pressed her hand to the glass and felt the cool surface against her palm. She had chosen this. This life, this peace, this quiet. She had refused the bond, refused him, because she couldn't imagine losing herself in the noise and power of his world. But standing here now, watching the world move on without her, she wondered if she had lost herself anyway. She thought about him more often than she wanted to admit. In the moments between waking and sleeping, in the stillness before dawn, in the space where her heartbeat should have been steady but felt fractured instead, she wondered where he was, what he was doing, if he ever stood at a window and thought of her the way she thought of him, if he regretted claiming her at all. The thought twisted something deep inside her. She should have felt relieved if he had moved on. She should have felt vindicated, proof that she had been right to walk away, that the bond would have been just another expectation, another cage. But she didn't feel relieved. She felt hollow. The nightmare started a few days later. Not every night, but enough. She would wake in the dark with her heart racing and her skin damp with sweat, the remnants of dreams she couldn't quite remember clinging to the edges of her mind. In them, she was running, always running, through the forest, through shadows, through firelight. And behind her, a voice called her name. His voice. Steady and low, and filled with something she couldn't name. She never turned back in the dreams, she just kept running. And when she woke, she lay in the dark and felt the ache in her chest grow sharper. One morning, she stood at her work table and found herself staring at nothing. Her hands rested on the wood, unmoving. The herbs she had been sorting lay scattered in front of her. She couldn't remember what she had been doing. Couldn't remember why she had started. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Then, another. She had made the right choice. She had. But if that was true, why did it feel like she was disappearing? The knock at her door startled her. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and crossed the room. When she opened the door, she found Tomas standing there, his face tight with worry. Alara, he said quickly, we need you at the eastern edge. Someone's been hurt. She grabbed her pack without hesitation and followed him through the village. Her body moved on instinct now, steady and sure. This was what she knew. This was what she could control. The man they brought her to had been clawed across the shoulder. Deep, but not fatal. She cleaned the wound and stitched it carefully, her hands steady even as the man winced and bit back groans. When she finished, she wrapped his shoulder in clean cloth and told him to rest. But as she worked, she heard the others talking in low voices nearby. It was a rogue, one of them said. Came out of nowhere. They're getting closer, another murmured. This is the third attack in 2 weeks. Someone needs to do something. Alara's hands stilled for just a moment. Then she tied off the bandage and stood. She didn't ask questions. She didn't want to know. But the words followed her anyway, sinking into her chest like stones. That night, she sat by her fire and stared into the flames. The cottage was warm, but she felt cold. The attacks were escalating. She had heard whispers before, but she had told herself it wasn't her concern, that the pack would handle it, that she was safe here. But now she wasn't so sure. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched the fire crackle and shift. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. She thought of the man with the clawed shoulder, the fear in the villagers' eyes, the way they had looked toward the forest, as though something dark and unseen was waiting just beyond the trees. She thought of Kalen. She didn't want to, but his face rose in her mind anyway. The steadiness of his gaze, the quiet strength in the way he had stood across the fire and waited for her answer, the way he had let her go, without argument, without force. She wondered if he knew about the attacks, if he was doing something to stop them, if he thought of this village at all, if he thought of her. She pressed her hand to her chest again, over the place where the ache had settled. She had walked away from him because she didn't want to be claimed, didn't want to lose herself, didn't want to belong to someone who might not see her as more than a bond, a destiny, a title. But sitting here now, alone in the dark, she wondered if she had made the biggest mistake of her life, and she wondered if it was already too late to take it back. Aria was kneeling in her garden when she heard the horses. She looked up, her hands still dirt-stained from pulling weeds, and watched as a line of riders appeared at the edge of the village. They moved in formation, steady and purposeful, their cloaks dark against the pale morning sky. The villagers stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. No one spoke, but Aria could feel the shift in the air, the way tension rippled through the square like wind across water. She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. Her heart began to pound before she even saw him. But she knew. Somehow, she already knew. Kalen rode at the front. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze sweeping over the village with quiet authority. He wore no crown, no formal regalia, but there was no mistaking who he was. The others followed his lead without question. He didn't need to raise his voice or issue commands. His presence alone was enough. Alara's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't seen him since the night she walked away. Hadn't heard his voice or felt his gaze, or stood close enough to feel the warmth that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. She had told herself it was better that way. That distance would make it easier, that eventually the ache would fade, and she would stop thinking of him every time she closed her eyes. But now he was here, and all the careful walls she had built around herself felt suddenly fragile. Kalen's gaze swept across the square, and then it landed on her. He went still. His horse took 2 more steps before he gently pulled the reins, stopping just short of the village well. His eyes didn't leave hers. Aria felt her pulse spike. She wanted to look away, wanted to turn and walk back into her cottage and pretend she hadn't seen him. But she couldn't move. She stood there in the middle of her garden, dirt on her hands, and her hair falling loose from its tie, and met his gaze across the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then one of the riders called out, breaking the stillness. "Alpha, where do you want us stationed?" Kalen didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly, and then he turned his head, breaking eye contact. Aria felt the loss of it like a chill. He dismounted smoothly and handed his reins to one of the others. "North and east perimeters first," he said quietly. "Spread out and assess the damage. I want a full report by midday." The riders nodded and dispersed. moving through the village with practiced efficiency. The villagers watched them go, murmuring softly among themselves. A few of the elders approached Kalen, their expressions wary but respectful. He spoke to them in that same calm, steady voice, listening more than he talked. He asked questions. He didn't make demands. Alara stayed where she was, her heart still racing. She told herself to go inside, to let him do whatever it was he came here to do and stay out of his way. She didn't owe him anything, didn't need to explain herself or apologize or pretend that seeing him again didn't make her chest feel tight and her hands shake. But then he looked at her again, just a glance, brief and careful, before he turned back to the elders. And she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, longing. Her breath hitched. She pressed her hand to her chest, over the ache that never seemed to leave, and forced herself to turn away. She walked back into her cottage and closed the door behind her. She leaned against it, her eyes closed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. He was here, and she didn't know what to do. Aria stayed inside for the rest of the morning. She busied herself with small tasks, organizing her dried herbs and refilling jars, and pretending that she wasn't listening for his voice outside her window. But she was. She heard him speaking to the villagers, his tone gentle and reassuring. She heard the sound of his boots on the dirt path, steady and unhurried. She heard the way people responded to him, not with fear, but with trust. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. By midday, she couldn't stay inside any longer. She told herself it was because she needed to check on the injured man from the other night, that she was a healer, and healers didn't hide. But the truth was harder to ignore. She wanted to see him, wanted to hear his voice directed at her instead of through walls and windows, wanted to know why he had come. She stepped outside and found him standing near the well, speaking quietly with one of his riders. He glanced up as soon as the door opened, and their eyes met again. This time, he didn't look away. The rider said something, but Kalen's attention was already elsewhere. He nodded absently, dismissing him, and then he walked toward her. His steps were slow, measured, as though he was giving her the chance to retreat if she wanted to. But Lara didn't move. She stood in front of her door and watched him approach, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He stopped a few paces away, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, close enough that she could feel the pull between them, the invisible thread that still connected them no matter how hard she tried to sever it. "Alara," he said quietly. Her name sounded different in his voice, softer, like something precious. She swallowed hard. "Alpha." His jaw tightened slightly, and she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes before he masked it. "You don't have to call me that." "I don't know what else to call you." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and searching, as though he was trying to read something written across her face. "I came because of the attacks," he said finally. "The council received reports. I wanted to make sure the villages along the border were safe. You didn't have to come yourself." "I know." The weight of those two words settled between them. Alara looked down at her hands, her throat tight. She wanted to ask him why he had really come, wanted to know if it was just duty or something more, but she was afraid of the answer, afraid that it might be the one she wanted most, and feared in equal measure. "How have you been?" he asked softly. She looked up, startled by the question, by the gentleness in his voice. "I'm fine, Alara. I said I'm fine." He didn't push. He just nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "If you need anything," he said quietly, "I'm here." She wanted to tell him she didn't need anything, that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself, that his presence here didn't change anything. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with all the other things she couldn't say. so she just nodded. Kalen hesitated, as though he wanted to say something more. Then he took a step back, giving her space. "I'll be stationed nearby for a while," he said, "until we're certain the threat has passed." Alara's heart clenched. "You're staying?" "Yes." She didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to feel. So she just nodded again, her hands still clasped tightly in front of her. Kalen held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and walked away, his steps steady and sure. Alara watched him go, her chest aching with something she couldn't name. And when he disappeared around the corner, she pressed her hand over her heart and wondered how long she could keep pretending that she didn't still feel the bond between them, pulling tighter with every breath. Alara saw him again the next morning, standing near the well in the village square. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just watching, listening. A small girl approached him shyly, holding a wooden doll with a broken arm. Alara paused in the doorway of the healer's cottage, her basket of herbs forgotten in her hands. Kalen knelt down without hesitation, bringing himself to the child's height. He took the doll carefully, examining it with the same seriousness he might have given a council report. The girl said something Alara couldn't hear, and Kalen nodded thoughtfully. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of leather cord. He wrapped it gently around the doll's broken limb, tying it with practiced ease. When he handed it back, the girl's face lit up with joy. She threw her arms around his neck, and Kalen went very still. Just for a moment. Then his hand came up slowly, resting lightly on her back. When she pulled away and ran off laughing, he stayed there on one knee, watching her go. The expression on his face was so tender, it made Alara's chest ache. She turned away before he could see her watching, but the image stayed with her all day. That evening, Mrs. Hale came to the cottage, just as Alara was closing up for the night. The older woman was breathless, her face flushed. "It's my husband," she said quickly. "He fell from the ladder fixing the roof. I think his arm is broken." Alara grabbed her supplies and followed her through the darkening streets. When they reached the Hale house, Alara found Mr. Hale sitting in a chair by the fire, his face pale and his arm cradled against his chest. She knelt beside him and examined the injury carefully. It was broken, but cleanly. She could set it. She worked quietly, her hands steady, despite the man's occasional groans of pain. Mrs. Hale hovered nearby, wringing her hands. Alara had just finished wrapping the splint when there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hale opened it, and Kalen stepped inside. His gaze went immediately to Alara, then to the injured man. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Alara shook her head. "I've set the bone. He needs rest now." Kalen nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he moved to the far side of the room and began stacking firewood that had spilled from the overturned basket. He worked without asking, without drawing attention to himself, just helping. When Alara finished and stood to leave, Kalen was still there. He walked her to the door, and Mrs. Hale pressed a loaf of bread into her hands with teary gratitude. Outside, the night air was cool and soft. Alara started down the path, and Kalen fell into step beside her. "You didn't have to stay," she said after a moment. "I know. You have other things to do. Nothing more important than this." She glanced at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. He was looking straight ahead, his hands relaxed at his sides. There was no urgency in his stride. No impatience. Just steady presence. They walked in silence for a while. The village was quiet around them, lamps glowing softly in windows. Alara could hear the distant sound of the river, the rustle of wind through the trees. It should have felt awkward, walking beside him like this. But it didn't. It felt easy. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping them. It was nothing. It wasn't nothing to them." He didn't answer, but she saw the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. When they reached her cottage, Alara stopped at the gate. She turned to face him, her hand still clutching the bread Mrs. Hale had given her. "You don't have to walk me home every time." "I know." "Kaylin?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the weight of his gaze made her breath catch. "I'm not trying to change your mind, Alara," he said quietly. "I'm not here to convince you of anything. I want you to be safe. That's all." Her throat tightened. "I am safe." "I know you are. You're strong, capable. You don't need anyone." He paused, and something flickered in his eyes. "But that doesn't mean you have to be alone." The words settled between them like stones in still water. Alara didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the quiet honesty in his voice. So she just nodded, her chest tight, and turned toward the cottage. "Good night, Alara." "Good night." She didn't look back, but she felt him there, standing by the gate, until she was safely inside. Over the following days, she began to notice him more, not because he sought her out. He didn't. But because he was always there, in the background, steady and quiet. He helped rebuild a fence damaged in the last attack. He carried water for the widow down the lane. He sat with the village elder in the evenings, listening to stories that had been told 100 times before. He never asked for thanks, never drew attention to himself. He just showed up and stayed. Alara found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice, watching the way he listened when people spoke, his full attention on them, as though their words were the most important thing in the world, watching the way he moved, unhurried and sure, watching the way he smiled, rare and genuine, when someone made him laugh. It was different from what she had expected, different from the stories she had heard about alpha kings. He wasn't commanding or distant. He didn't demand respect or obedience. He simply earned it, quietly, through kindness and care and the kind of steady presence that made people feel safe. One afternoon, Alara was gathering herbs near the forest edge when she heard raised voices. She turned and saw 2 men arguing near the edge of the square. Their voices were getting louder, angrier. One of them shoved the other, and Alara's stomach dropped. Before she could move, Kaylin was there. He stepped between them, calm and unhurried, his hands raised slightly. He said something too low for Alara to hear. The men stopped, breathing hard, their fists still clenched. Kaylin spoke again, his voice still quiet, still steady. Slowly, the tension drained from the men's shoulders. One of them nodded. The other looked away, shame crossing his face. Kaylin said something else, and both men turned and walked away in opposite directions. No shouting, no force, just calm. Alara realized she was staring. Kaylin glanced over and saw her watching. For a moment, their eyes met. Then he gave her a small nod and turned back toward the village center. That night, Alara lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the way he had knelt for the child with the broken doll, the way he had stacked firewood without being asked, the way he had stopped a fight with nothing but his presence and his words. She thought about the way he looked at her, not with possession or expectation, but with patience, with understanding, with something that felt dangerously close to devotion. And she realized, with a sharp pang of fear and longing, that she was starting to see him, not as the Alpha King, not as the bond she had rejected, but as the man he had always been beneath it all, the man she had been too afraid to let herself know, the man who was quietly, steadily, breaking down every wall she had built around her heart. The attack came just after dusk. Alara was closing the shutters when she heard the first scream. Her heart lurched. She grabbed her medicine bag and ran outside, already knowing what she would find. Rogues, 3 of them, circling near the southern edge of the village. Their eyes were wild, their movements erratic. One of them lunged at old Thomas, who stumbled backward, terror written across his face. Before Alara could shout, Kalen was there. He moved like water, smooth and certain. He caught the rogue mid-leap and threw him back with controlled force. The creature hit the ground hard, but scrambled up again, snarling. Kalen's voice was low and commanding. He spoke words Alara didn't recognize, but the authority in them was unmistakable. The rogue hesitated. The other 2 circled warily. Kalen moved forward, placing himself between the rogues and the villagers. His shoulders were broad, his stance calm. He didn't attack. He simply stood, steady and immovable. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the rogues turned and fled into the forest. The villagers erupted in grateful murmurs. Thomas gripped Kalen's arm, his voice shaking with thanks. Others gathered around, asking questions, checking the perimeter. Alara stood frozen near her doorway, her pulse still racing. Kalen's gaze found hers across the crowd. Even from that distance, she could see the tension in his jaw, the sharp concern in his eyes. He crossed to her in 3 long strides. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, urgent. She shook her head. "I'm fine. Thank you." He exhaled slowly, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "They'll come back. Not tonight, but soon. They're testing the boundaries." Alara's stomach tightened. "How many?" "Enough to be dangerous." He glanced toward the forest. "I'll patrol the perimeter tonight. You should stay inside." "I need to check on Thomas," she said quietly. "Make sure he's not injured." Kalen nodded. "I'll walk with you." She wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she didn't need his protection. But the truth was, her hands were trembling, and having him beside her made the fear easier to carry. They walked together through the village, checking each home, making sure everyone was safe. Kalen's presence was calming, his quiet competence a balm to the frightened villagers. By the time they finished, full dark had fallen. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Alara looked toward her cottage, then back at Kalen. He was watching the tree line, his posture alert. She spoke before she could stop herself. "You should come inside." He turned to her, surprise flickering across his face. "It's going to rain," she said quickly, "and you'll be more used to everyone if you're dry and rested. You can keep watch from the window just as well." For a moment he didn't answer. Then he nodded slowly. "If you're sure, I'm sure." Her cottage felt smaller with him inside. He stood near the door, careful not to intrude, his gaze sweeping the room as though memorizing every detail. Alara lit the fire and set water to boil for tea. Her hands were steadier now, but her heart still beat unevenly. Kalen moved to the window, looking out into the darkness. "I'll stay by the door. You should rest." "I won't sleep," she said honestly. "Not tonight." He glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. "Neither will I." She poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one. He took it carefully, their fingers brushing for just a moment. The touch sent warmth through her chest. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire crackling softly between them. Outside, the rain began to fall, For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, almost companionable. Alara sipped her tea and watched the firelight dance across Kalen's face. He looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes, tension in the set of his jaw. She wondered how many nights he had gone without sleep, patrolling borders and protecting villages that weren't even his own. "Why are you really here?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You know why. Tell me anyway." He set his cup down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Because I couldn't stay away. Because the thought of you in danger made it hard to breathe. Because," he paused, his voice dropping, "because even if you never choose me, I'll still do everything I can to keep you safe." Her throat tightened. "That's not fair to you." "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But it's the truth." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what I'm doing, Kalen. I don't know how to let someone in like this." "You don't have to know," he said gently. "You just have to try." She met his eyes, and something in her chest cracked open. "I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing myself," she whispered. "Of becoming someone I don't recognize. Of being swallowed whole by something I can't control." He was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and careful. "When I was younger, I watched my father rule. He was strong, respected, feared. But he was also alone. He never let anyone close, never trusted anyone enough to share the weight he carried." He paused, his gaze distant. "When he died, I realized he had spent his entire life building walls, and in the end, those walls were all he had left." Alara's chest ached. "I don't want that," Kalen said softly. "I don't want strength that comes from isolation. I don't want a bond built on duty or obligation. I want—" He looked at her, his eyes steady and warm. "I want to know you, the real you, not the version you think you're supposed to be." She felt tears prick her eyes. "What if the real me isn't enough?" "Lara." His voice was firm, gentle. "You've been enough since the moment I saw you." The words hit her like a wave. She blinked hard, trying to hold herself together. Kalen rose slowly and moved around the hearth. He knelt in front of her, his gaze level with hers. "I'm not asking you to lose yourself," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to let me stand beside you, to share the burden, to be someone you can lean on when you're tired, and someone who leans on you in return." She looked at him, her vision blurred with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can." "Then let's start smaller," he said. "Let's start with tonight." She let out a shaky breath. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't have to be afraid alone," he said softly. "It means I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, and you don't have to carry everything by yourself." Something inside her broke. A dam she had been holding closed for far too long. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "I know," he said gently. "So am I." She looked at him in surprise. "You are?" He nodded. "I'm terrified of failing you, of not being what you need, of losing you before I ever really have you." Her chest tightened. "Kalen, but I'd rather be terrified with you," he said quietly, "than safe without you." She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. He reached up with his free hand and gently brushed them away, his touch feather light. "Stay," she whispered. "Tonight. Just stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. They sat together by the fire, hands entwined, the storm raging outside while warmth grew between them. And for the first time since she had walked away from him at the moon gathering, Alara let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to choose between freedom and love. Maybe she could have both. The fire had burned low by the time the storm outside began to quiet. The rain still fell, but softer now, a gentle rhythm against the roof that seemed to echo the steady beating of Alara's heart. She hadn't let go of Kaelin's hand. He sat beside her on the floor, his back against the stone of the hearth, his presence solid and unhurried. There was no urgency between them now, only a quiet peace that felt more profound than any words they'd spoken. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. He turned his head slightly, his gaze patient. "I'm listening." She took a breath, gathering courage. "When I walked away from you at the moon gathering, it wasn't because I didn't feel the bond." His hand tightened gently around hers, but he said nothing. "It was because I felt it too much," she continued. "It terrified me, the certainty of it, the way it pulled at me, like something beyond my control." She paused, her voice dropping. "I thought if I gave in, I'd lose myself, that I'd become someone who existed only for you and I'd forget who I was before." Kaelin was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Did someone teach you that? That love means losing yourself?" She nodded slowly. "My mother. She loved my father so completely that when he died, she couldn't find her way back. She became a shadow. I watched her fade, year after year, until there was nothing left of the woman she used to be." "I'm sorry," he said softly. "That must have been unbearable to witness." "It was," she whispered, "and I swore I would never let that happen to me, that I would never need someone so much that losing them would destroy me." He turned toward her fully, his expression open and aching. "Alara, I can't promise you that loss won't hurt, that grief won't be real if something happens, but I can promise you this." He brought their joined hands up, holding them between them. "I will never ask you to disappear into me. I will never ask you to become less so I can be more." She looked at him, her eyes burning. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen you," he said simply. "I've seen your strength, your kindness, your stubborn independence. And I don't want to change a single part of it. I want to know it better. I want to see it grow." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. "You think the bond will erase you? I think it will let you become more fully yourself, because you won't have to carry everything alone anymore." The words settled into her chest, warm and steady. "I was wrong," she said quietly, "to think freedom and love were opposites, to think I had to choose one or the other." "You weren't wrong to be afraid," Kaelin said. "Fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." She smiled faintly through her tears. "You're very wise for a king." "I've had a lot of time to think," he admitted. "Especially these past months. Wondering if I'd lost you before I ever really knew you." "You didn't lose me," she said softly. "I just needed time to find my way back." He reached up with his free hand and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so tender, it made her breath catch. "I'm glad you did," he said. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. Alara felt something shift inside her, something that had been locked tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Hope. "Kaelin," she said quietly. "Yes?" "I was wrong to walk away from you." He shook his head gently. "You did what you needed to do, there's no shame in that." "But I hurt you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I saw it in your eyes that night, and I've carried that with me ever since." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "You did hurt me," he admitted, "but not because you rejected the bond. Because I thought I'd never get the chance to show you who I really am." To prove that I could be someone you'd choose, not just someone fate handed you." She looked at him, her heart aching. "You didn't have to prove anything." "Maybe not to you," he said softly. "But I needed to prove it to myself. That I could be the kind of man worthy of standing beside you. Not as a king, just as myself." She felt tears slip down her cheeks again, and this time she didn't try to stop them. "You are worthy. You always were." He smiled, a small, tender curve of his lips. "Then maybe we're both learning something." She laughed softly, the sound watery but real. "Maybe we are." Kalen shifted slightly, his hand still holding hers. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "What made you decide to come back?" he asked gently. "Not physically, but here, with me, in this moment." She thought about it, her gaze drifting to the fire. "I think I realized that I was more afraid of never knowing what we could be than I was of getting hurt. That walking away didn't make me braver, it just made me lonelier." He nodded slowly. "I understand that." "Do you?" she asked, looking back at him. "I spent years telling myself I didn't need anyone," he said quietly. "That being strong meant standing alone. That needing someone was weakness." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "But then I met you, and I realized that the strongest thing I could ever do was let myself need you. Let myself be vulnerable with you." Her breath caught. "Kalen, I don't want to be alone anymore," he said softly. "And I don't think you do either." She shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "I don't." He reached up and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away her tears. "Then let's stop being alone. Together." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I'm still scared." "So am I," he whispered. "But I'd rather face it with you than without you." She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, and saw everything she'd been too afraid to see before. His steadiness, his kindness, his quiet strength that didn't demand or dominate, but simply held space for her to be exactly who she was. She saw love. "I want to try," she said softly. "I want to try being with you, really being with you." His eyes brightened, hope and relief flooding his expression. "Are you sure?" "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but I'm sure." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Their foreheads touched, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her lips. The bond hummed between them, no longer a chain but a thread, delicate and strong all at once. "I won't let you down," he whispered. "I know," she said softly, "and I won't run away again." "I know." They stayed like that, foreheads pressed together, hands entwined, the fire warming them as the storm outside finally stilled. And in that quiet, sacred moment, Alara felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt whole, not because Kalen completed her, but because he made space for her to complete herself, because he saw her, truly saw her, and loved her not in spite of her fears, but with full understanding of them. And that, she realized, was what she'd been searching for all along. Not someone to save her, someone to stand beside her. The morning arrived softly, pale light filtering through the window where the storm had raged hours before. Alara woke slowly, her head resting against something warm and solid. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then she felt the steady rise and fall of breathing beneath her cheek and realized she'd fallen asleep against Kalen's shoulder. He was still there, still holding her. She lifted her head carefully, not wanting to wake him, but his eyes were already open. He'd been watching the fire burn down to embers, keeping vigil while she slept. "You should have woken me," she whispered. "You needed rest," he said quietly. "So did I. This was rest enough." She sat up slowly, feeling the ache in her muscles from the long night. But her heart felt lighter than it had in months, maybe years. "I meant what I said last night," she told him softly. "I'm not running away again." He looked at her with such steady certainty that it took her breath away. "I know." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the village below. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and still. Sunlight touched the rooftops, and smoke rose from chimneys as families stirred awake. Kaylin came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on what you want," he said gently. She thought about that. About the life she'd built here, quiet and safe. About the bond that hummed between them, no longer frightening, but simply present, waiting. About the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and strong all at once. "I want to know you," she said finally. "Not the Alpha King everyone talks about. Just you." "I'd like that," he said softly. She turned to face him fully. "And I want you to know me, the real me, not just the healer who rejected you at the moon gathering." He smiled, a small, genuine expression that softened his entire face. "I'm already beginning to." They stood there in the quiet morning light, and Alara felt the weight of her decision settle over her. Not heavy, not suffocating, just real. "I'll need time," she said. "I can't just leave everything here and follow you to the capital tomorrow." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I'll stay as long as you need me to. And when you're ready, we'll figure out what comes next. Together." Together. That word didn't scare her anymore. "The village still needs protection," she said. "The rogues are being dealt with," he assured her. "My guards are coordinating patrols. This place will be safe. You'll be safe." She believed him. That was new too, believing someone when they promised her safety. "Will you stay for breakfast?" she asked. "It's the least I can offer after you spent the night protecting me from my own fears." His eyes warmed. "I'd like that." She moved to the small kitchen area, gathering what she had. Bread, cheese, dried fruit. Simple things, but enough. Kaylin helped without being asked, setting the table with the ease of someone who didn't need to be served. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the table, and something would pass between them. Recognition, understanding, hope. After they finished, Kaylin stood to leave, but Alara reached for his hand before he could step away. "Wait," she said softly. He turned back, his expression open and patient. She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I need you to know something. I'm listening. When I walked away from you at the moon gathering, it wasn't because I didn't feel the bond," she said. "It was because I felt it too much. It terrified me. The idea of needing someone that deeply, of letting someone have that kind of power over my heart." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know. But last night, you showed me something I'd never understood before," she continued. "You showed me that needing someone doesn't make me weak, that letting someone in doesn't mean losing myself. It just means not being alone anymore." His thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand. "You were never weak, Alara, not for one moment." "I felt weak," she admitted. "Every time I thought about you, every time I wondered if I'd made a mistake. And now?" She met his eyes, letting him see everything she felt. The fear, yes, but also the hope, the longing, the beginning of something she'd stopped letting herself believe in. "Now I think maybe the bravest thing I can do is stop running," she said. "Stop protecting myself so carefully that I never let anyone close enough to matter." "I matter to you?" he asked quietly. "You matter to me," she said. "More than I wanted to admit. More than I knew how to handle." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Then let me prove I'm worth the risk." "You already have," she whispered. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, stepping into the circle of his arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. His hands settled on her waist, warm and steady. Her palms rested against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. "I won't rush you," he said softly. "Whatever you need, whatever time it takes, I'll be here." "I know," she said. "That's what makes this possible." He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she rose on her toes and met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, tender, a promise more than a demand. His lips were warm against hers, patient and kind, and she felt the bond between them settle into place like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to force for too long. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, breathing him in. "I was so afraid of this," she whispered. "Of me? Of us? Of what it would mean to choose you?" "And now?" he asked, his voice soft with hope. She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the Alpha King, but simply Kalen. The man who'd waited patiently while she found her courage. Who'd protected her village without asking for thanks. Who'd held her through a storm and let her cry without trying to fix everything with empty words. "Now I think maybe I've been afraid of the wrong thing," she said. "I was so scared of losing myself that I forgot what it felt like to truly live." He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "Then live, Alara, with me, beside me, however you need to." "I want to try," she said. "Really try. Not just say the words, but mean them." "That's all I've ever wanted," he said softly. "Just a chance. Just you. Choosing me because you want to, not because fate said you should." She smiled, and it felt like the first real smile she'd worn in months. "Then I choose you, Kalen. I choose this. I choose us." His expression transformed, hope and relief and love all tangled together in his eyes. "You won't regret it." "I know," she said, "because you'll make sure I don't have to." He kissed her again, slow and sweet, and she let herself fall into it, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have this, could have him, could have a future that wasn't built on fear and loneliness, but on trust and partnership and love that grew from honest choice. When he finally left that morning, walking back toward the village center where his men waited, Alara stood in her doorway and watched him go. But this time, she wasn't watching him leave. She was watching him walk into her life. Properly, truly, and she couldn't wait to see where they'd go from here. The moon rose full and bright over the forest clearing, casting silver light across the gathered witnesses. Alara stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle, her heart steady in her chest for the first time in what felt like years. She wore a simple white dress, nothing grand or ornate, just soft linen that moved gently in the evening breeze. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and she'd woven small wild flowers through the strands that morning, sitting at her kitchen table while her hands worked on muscle memory alone. This wasn't the moon gathering where she'd first refused him. That had been huge, formal, filled with hundreds of wolves from every pack across the territories. This ceremony was something quieter, something theirs. Just the people who mattered most, gathered under the open sky to witness what she and Kalen had chosen to build together. She could see him across the clearing, speaking quietly with his second-in-command. He wore dark clothes, simple and clean, nothing that screamed of his title or rank. He'd told her weeks ago that he didn't want this night to be about the Alpha King claiming his destined mate. He wanted it to be about two people choosing each other freely, without the weight of duty or prophecy pressing down on them. Her fingers twisted together briefly, a flicker of old nervousness rising in her chest. But it wasn't the same fear she'd carried before. This wasn't terror of losing herself, or being swallowed whole by someone else's life. This was just the normal anxiety of standing on the edge of something new and precious, hoping she wouldn't stumble. Kaelin looked up then, as if he'd felt her gaze, and their eyes met across the distance. He smiled, slow and warm, and everything in her settled. He started walking toward her, closing the space between them with calm, measured steps, and she found herself moving to meet him halfway without conscious thought. "You look beautiful," he said softly when they stood face to face. "You look nervous," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. He laughed quietly, the sound easing some of the tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I am. Terrified, actually." "Of what?" "That I'll mess this up somehow, say the wrong thing, do something that makes you doubt." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You won't." "You sound very sure." "I am," she said simply. "Because I know you now, Kaelin. Really know you. And I trust you." His throat worked as he swallowed, emotion flickering across his face. "That means everything to me." The elder who would officiate the ceremony approached them then, an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair braided down her back. She'd known Alara since childhood, had taught her about herbs and healing when she was barely tall enough to see over the workbench. Having her here to witness this moment felt right in a way Alara couldn't quite put into words. "Are you both ready?" the elder asked gently. Alara looked at Kaelin and found him already watching her, waiting for her answer before he gave his own. She nodded. "Yes. Yes," he echoed. The elder smiled and gestured for them to step into the center of the circle. The witnesses gathered closer, forming a loose ring around them. Alara recognized faces from her village, people she'd healed and helped over the years. And there were wolves from Kaelin's guard, men and women who'd come to respect the quiet healer who'd somehow captured their king's heart without ever trying. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand speeches or elaborate rituals, just honest words spoken under the moon, promises made with clear eyes and open hearts. "I won't promise to be perfect," Alara said when it was her turn to speak. Her voice carried clearly in the quiet night. "I'll make mistakes. I'll probably doubt myself sometimes, and I might need you to remind me that I'm strong enough for this." Kaelin's hand tightened around hers. "But I promise to choose you," she continued. "Every day. Not because fate decided we should be together, but because I want to be. Because you make me feel brave and safe and seen in ways I never thought possible." She paused, gathering her thoughts, feeling the weight of every word. "I promise to stand beside you, not behind you. To be your partner, not just your mate. And I promise to trust that you'll keep seeing me as I am, not as what you might want me to become." His eyes were bright in the moonlight, emotion clear on his face. Then it was his turn, and when he spoke, his voice was steady despite the feeling she could see running through him. "I promise to protect you," he said. "Not just your life, but your heart, your dreams, your right to be exactly who you are, without compromise or sacrifice." He lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles before continuing. "I promise to listen when you need to speak, and to wait when you need time, to never take your trust for granted or assume I know what's best for you." His thumb brushed across the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar now it made her chest ache. "And I promise to love you not because destiny said I should, but because I choose to. Every single day, for as long as you'll let me." The elder spoke the traditional words then, about bonds and moonlight and the sacred nature of choice, but Alara barely heard them. She was too focused on Kalen's face, on the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. When the elder finally said the words that sealed their bond, Kalen stepped closer and cupped Alara's face, gently in his hands. "May I?" he asked softly, even now giving her the choice. She answered by rising on her toes and closing the distance between them. The kiss was tender and sure, a promise kept, and a future claimed. Around them, the witnesses cheered and called blessings, but Alara barely registered the sound. All she felt was Kalen, solid and real, and hers, and the bone-deep certainty that she'd made the right choice. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For giving me a chance. For trusting me. For being brave enough to try." She smiled, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest. "Thank you for waiting, for not giving up on me even when I gave up on us." "I could never give up on you," he said simply. "Not then, not ever." Later, after the ceremony ended and the witnesses had filtered away into the night, Kalen and Alara walked back through the forest toward her cottage. Their cottage now, she supposed, though they'd figure out the details later. His hand was warm in hers, their fingers intertwined comfortably. "What are you thinking?" he asked as they moved through the moonlit trees. "That I'm glad I rejected you the first time," she said honestly. He stopped walking, turning to look at her with surprise. "Really?" She nodded. "Because everything that happened after, all the time we spent learning each other, building trust instead of just accepting what fate handed us, I think we needed that. I needed that." He was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "I think you might be right. We got here the long way around," she said. "But I think maybe we're stronger for it." "I know we are," he agreed, pulling her close. She wrapped her arms around him and let herself rest there, safe and chosen and home. The moon watched over them through the trees, and for the first time since the night she'd walked away from destiny, Alara felt completely at peace.